Welcome to the Eye of Truth. Our consciousness can change physical phenomena. The result of doing something could actually occur before whatever caused it. The future can change the past. What on earth am I talking about? Everything I've just stated are results observed during a certain physics experiment. This experiment has been modified several times by researchers over time, and yet its results continue to bewilder or even chill researchers. In this video, I cover the strangest physics experiment ever conducted, which just might reveal the true nature of our world. Don't worry, you don't need to know anything about physics to understand this, so be sure to watch until the end. Before I get started, there's something you should know about. 300 years ago, we still didn't understand what light truly is. The greatest physicist of the time, Isaac Newton, believed that light was a stream of tiny particles. However, in 1807, a physicist by the name of Thomas Young conducted a simple experiment that proved that light was not simply a particle. This experiment is called the double-slit experiment. It consists of three parts: a light source, a plate with two narrow slits, and a screen. When the light source is turned on, light passes through the two slits and hits the screen. If light were a simple particle, the particles passing from the light source through the two slits would appear as two straight lines on the screen. But that's not what happens. Instead, we see bright and dark bands on the screen. This is exactly the same pattern that would be formed by overlapping waves, whether caused by water in the ocean or sound in the air. This proved that light is not a simple particle but is instead a wave. However, research a century later by physicists such as Albert Einstein and Louis Victor de Broglie revealed that light is actually both a particle and a wave. Modern researchers describe light as having both a particle nature and wave nature. The individual particles of light are called photons. With that out of the way, here's where things start to get strange. The double-slit experiment was first modified in 1909 by a physicist named Jeffrey Ingram Taylor. He adjusted the light source so that it would output a single photon at a time. This meant that only a single photon would reach the plate at a time. Since there are two slits on the plate, each photon would pass through only one of them. You'd think that this would prevent waves between photons from overlapping. In other words, you'd expect to see two straight lines instead of the band pattern observed in the first double-slit experiment. This is what Taylor expected to see when he began his experiment. However, he was surprised to see the familiar band pattern of overlapping waves on the screen. He checked his equipment and made sure that only a single photon was passing through the plate at a time. Taylor interpreted the surprising results of his experiment as follows. Each photon was passing through both slits at the same time, creating an overlapping wave within the photon itself. This defied common sense, and other researchers suggested implementing some physical means of recording to observe how the photons were behaving. This would prove whether they were passing through both slits at the same time. 70 years later, in the 1970s, a system capable of recording and observing the movement of photons was finally developed. Physicists immediately put it to work, verifying the double-slit experiment. The results were eerie. When using the same setup as Taylor's experiment, the stream of single photons showed up as bands on the screen. They then ran the experiment again under the same conditions, while recording and observing at the plate to observe whether each photon was truly passing through both slits at the same time. Strangely, when they began recording and observing, the bands on the screen began to converge into two straight lines. When they stopped recording and observing, the two straight lines once again split into that familiar band pattern. Other than turning the recording and observing system on and off, no changes were made to the experiment. It seemed like the photons were behaving with some form of consciousness. Their wave nature was expressed only when the recording and observing system was turned off. In other words, only when they were not being observed. Once the system was turned on and they knew they were being observed, each photon would obediently pass through only a single slit, expressing its particle nature. This seems to make no sense. As far as we knew it, the results of physical phenomena don't change based on whether we are observing them. For example, Whether a ball reaches a goal shouldn't be affected in any way by the people watching it. However, this experiment showed that we can change the results of a process simply by observing it. In other words, the act of observation is itself an invention of human consciousness, and human consciousness was actually changing the results of the experiment. It is a cardinal rule of classic physics that human consciousness cannot affect physical phenomena. This rule had been broken. Physicists were flabbergasted, but that didn't stop them. They wanted to know what was happening, so they modified the experiment again. The next version of the experiment was designed by a physicist named John Wheeler. He designed a new observation system using optical equipment such as a partially transmitting mirror. I won't go into any specific details here, but Wheeler's objective was to record and observe photons after they had passed through the slits, in order to observe their behavior at that moment. First, he began his experiment without recording or observing anything. Without any systems observing them, the photons would pass through the slits and express their wave nature, leaving the familiar band pattern on the screen. Next, Wheeler began recording and observing at the point where the photons passed through the slits. The band pattern on the screen converged into two straight lines. When he stopped recording and observing, the straight lines were replaced by the original band pattern. You may already have realized this, but this is utterly disproved causality. Feeling lost? Imagine that the plate and the screen are 1 light-year apart. Now, let's take another look at that experiment. First, we began the experiment without recording or observing anything. When the photons pass through the slits on the plate, there's no system observing the photons anywhere. The photons express their wave nature and pass through both slits at the same time, creating an overlapping wave. When they arrive at the screen, they should form a band pattern. Next, we begin recording and observing 1 year after the photons pass through the slits, or the very moment that the photons finally reach the screen. We expect to see a band pattern on the screen, but instead see 2 straight lines. What does all this mean? When the experiment was first started a year ago, the photons passed through both slits at the same time and formed an overlapping wave. Once we began recording and observing, this causes a change in the past so that the photons have now passed through only a single slit with no overlapping waves. The past was changed simply by the act of observing and recording it 1 year later. Somehow, this experiment proves that the future can change the past. Of course, we can't really conduct the 1 light-year version of this experiment. It's just a thought experiment meant to help explain the results of the actual experiment. However, it's essentially no different from the modified experiment designed by John Wheeler. Based on what we currently know, there are 2 possible interpretations here. The first interpretation is that the concept of time doesn't actually exist. The past, present, and future all exist at the same time. This means that there's no such thing as causality based on time. Everything that occurs had already happened when the universe was created, and we are simply experiencing it all one moment at a time, like scenes from a movie. The fact that time seems to exist and advance in a direction we call the future is simply an illusion created by our consciousness. None of our concepts of time actually describe time itself. A day, or 24 hours, is simply a representation of the process of the Earth rotating once. Similarly, a year, or 365 days, represents the process of the Earth orbiting the Sun once. In other words, these concepts of time are simply expressions based on the dynamics of the Earth and actually just represent the amount of change when an object moves. If we consider this from a microscale perspective, it becomes even more obvious that time doesn't really exist. For example, consider electrons. Electrons orbit the nucleus of an atom. You learn this in school. However, this is quite different from how the Moon orbits the Earth. An electron orbiting a nucleus appears to exist at multiple places at the same time. Furthermore, the location of an electron is represented as a probability, and this probability varies depending on the location. In other words, an electron might have a probability of 30% at location A and a 70% probability at location B, but exists at both locations at the same time. Why is such a thing possible in the microscale world? If time doesn't really exist, then this would change what the concept of "at the same time" means. This means that a single electron existing in different locations at the same time wouldn't be a contradiction. This would also explain how the future seems to change the past in the double-slit experiment. The second interpretation is that our consciousness affects physical and natural phenomena, and that our world is somehow able to detect human consciousness and react accordingly. The Global Consciousness Project, GCP, is a project that was launched by around 100 researchers and engineers to investigate the degree to which human consciousness affects the real world. Researchers place devices that randomly generate numbers in 70 locations throughout the world and continue to observe this data for 15 years. The results were astonishing. The random number generators used electronic noise based on quantum tunneling to rapidly and randomly generate 100 numbers per second, with each number being either a 0 or 1. In most situations, the numbers generated by these devices were truly random. However, whenever there was a major event attracting attention all over the world, such as a war, major earthquake, or even the Olympics, data from the random number generators all over the world would become less random that day and would tend to be either all zeros or all ones. The GCP provided an interesting interpretation of these results. The data proves that human consciousness can affect the real world. However, the effect at the individual level is extremely small. When a major event on a global scale occurs, or when a large number of people share the same feelings or mindset, the impact of consciousness on the real world finally becomes observable. We still don't know exactly why human consciousness can affect the real world. However, John von Neumann and Eugene Wigner, both pioneers in the field of quantum mechanics, insisted that human consciousness can determine objective reality. It could be argued that the double-slit experiment, in its original and modified forms, played an important role in the birth of the field of quantum mechanics in modern physics. Although the results of this experiment defy common wisdom, there are actually many similarly bizarre phenomena in quantum mechanics. The unfortunate and sad reality is that we may never discover the true nature of our world within our lifetimes.